Welcome to the first public lecture to commemorate the inaugural session of the Young Researchers Workshop on Mobility and Migration. This workshop is a creation of collaborative endeavor by Kerala Council of Historical Research and Inter-University Center for Social Science Research and Extension. I'm pleased to introduce the eminent scholars present today officially to inaugurate the workshop. I welcome Professor P.K. Michael Tharakan, Honorable Chairman of Kerala Council of Historical Research, the Director of KCHR, Professor G. Arunima, Professor K.M. Sethi, the Director of IUCSSRE MGU, and Dr. V.J. Varghese, Associate Professor, the Department of History at University of Hyderabad, also resident scholar at KCHR. Please give a warm welcome to them. Let me first invite the Director of IUCSSRE, Professor K.M. Sethi, to deliver the welcome address.
Since my retirement in 2020, I have to keep something with me so that sometimes senility comes a bit early. Even names I forget. This is a wonderful occasion. I should say a momentous event. I start with the official address as chairperson of this meeting, Professor Arunima, Director KCHR. Our distinguished guest today, Professor P.K. Michael Tharakan, Chairman KCHR. The star of the day, the speaker, public lecture speaker, Professor Varghese, D.L. Varghese. My dear colleagues, friends, visiting fellows, I don't want to name each and every one, sometimes I forget. So I escape from this task of naming each and every one. So this is a great occasion for us to come together in this Convergence Academia complex. I understand that this is the first function here. I do not know whether some functions are already there in the... There is another function going? Yeah. So simultaneously we have these two programs. And this idea of convergence was mooted by our colleague Professor Rajan Gurikal when he was Vice Chancellor here about 10 years back. It was his idea, and the then government accepted this idea with a lot of support, and that's why that we have in every university a few centers called inter-university centers, or we added to that list inter-school centers and international centers and like that. We have a few. Though these centers already shifted here to this place, started functioning, it will take, I'm sure, it will take a little more time to get things settled for the full realization of this dream. I'm sure that this university will make sincere efforts towards the completion of this complex without much delay. So our center, Inter-University Center for Social Science Research, has been functioning in the School of Social Sciences for quite some time, for more than a decade. And it was really a painful moment to bid farewell to that campus, a very beautiful campus, and more so, a good academic fraternity in the SSS. We call it SSS. I'm sure that we have to continue our association with the SSS in different ways because that was the actual resource source of the center at the beginning. I must thank Dr. Professor Sanal Mohan and his colleagues for making this as a very challenging center. I must call it as a challenging center. So I assure you all, faculties, students and researchers in this campus, that we will continue to cater to the needs and aspirations of all students and faculties of this campus as well as the campuses of other universities. I think the very idea of inter-university centers is to foster these inter-university collaborations and programs, but that is seldom happening, unfortunately. We have made some efforts in that sense. That's why that KCHR is with us today as an important institution, having committed to research and academic programs. And I must say, frankly, that SSS has been instrumental in our long association with the KCHR. I'm not just saying that Sanal Mohan was there and everyone in the School of Social Sciences, right from the very beginning, even in the days of P.J. Cherian and others, Kain Panikar and others. So we are today, I'm not going to give a very long lecture. Actually, this is a small introduction and a formal welcome of our guests today. We have, as Nikhil mentioned, we have a 6-day program beginning with this public lecture today. KCHR under the chairmanship of Professor Michael Terren and the directorship of Professor Aranima has been doing a lot of work, a lot of programs and activities, and we are grateful to KCHR, Dr. Aranima, Professor Michael, Professor Varghese, Vijay Varghese, who is currently the scholar in residence at the KCHR, for initiating a lot of programs. And this is, of course, one of the important programs. We thought of having a gender workshop a couple of years back, and we almost finalized the commencement of the program, but suddenly COVID-19 set in and we had to postpone it. I think it's a postponement and we may hold it any time now. Maybe in another 6 months' time, we will approach KCHR to revive that program that we couldn't realize. Tomorrow we are starting a 5-day Young Scholars workshop on the theme Migration and Mobility, attended by a select group of scholars from across this country. KCHR had a lot of applications. They had to vet the applications and make a selection of 15 or 16 students. So we'll be having a wonderful time in the town, the outcome of which will be made known in some manner through KCHR and our center. So we are confident that this workshop will be a success from tomorrow onwards. So this will be a formal welcome, but I cannot be too formal to people who are so close to our heart, like Professor Michael Terren, Professor Aranima, and they are in fact a part and parcel of our system, IUCSSRE and MG University. Michael doesn't need any introduction. It will be a kind of an assault on his presence. He has been Vice Chancellor of Kannur University, Director of KILA, a senior faculty in the Center for Development Studies, Ramakrishna Hegde, Professor in ISAC in Bangalore. So many positions besides his current occupation as the chairman of this KCHR. I will welcome distinguished guests together after this brief introduction. We have with us Professor Aranima. Aranima also doesn't need any introduction. She's currently the director of KCHR, but basically she's professor in Center for Women's Studies in JNU. A very distinguished scholar, and if you just look at Google her profile, you will be surprised to see the kind of work that she has done as a Cambridge scholar in Trinity in the early 1980s or late 80s. And from Trinity, she has been traveling across and having several positions. I must say, University of Cologne, Germany. I think that was the last assignment to 2020. Then fellow and visiting fellow in different universities like New York University, Cambridge University, and I don't know whether I have to list out the whole list. And very impressive record of achievements with the publications and distinguished positions she held from institution to institution like that. We are fortunate to have her after the exit of our friend Sanal Mohan from KCHR, and her contribution towards this realization of this workshop is immense. It was actually Arunima's idea to hold this workshop here. So we took up this challenge. So the star of the day, Vijay Varghese, I must say that he is a distinguished scholar in migration studies in an unconventional way, but because whenever we think about migration studies, we have the images and impressions about certain figures here, and a lot of figures, migration like that. But Varghese has been traveling in a different way, in a different direction, in a different dimension. Presently, he is a senior faculty in University of Hyderabad, in the history faculty. He has an impressive academic profile with substantial work in the history of migration, which he has tried to analyze in an unconventional way. Most significantly, that he has focused on Kerala in a different way, unlike the Priyadarsini school, which is a totally different level of migration studies. And no offense meant to such studies, don't think like that. So we will listen to his perspective today, and he has worked as fellows, visiting fellows in CDS, University of Edinburgh, under the Charles Wallace India Fellowship, Central University of Europe, National University of Singapore, and also at the University of Sussex. Some of his volumes, publications included this Rutledge volume on mobility and buying vulnerability. I think some of you must be knowing it from the abstract that we have sent along with that. There is a small profile of Professor Varghese with us. And he has also profusely contributed to academic journal of national and international standing. We are fortunate to have Professor Varghese with us to deliver this public lecture today on an important topic, and they will be listening to him shortly. So I formally welcome three distinguished guests: Professor Michael Taragan, Professor Arunima, Professor Varghese, and all the distinguished participants in this seminar, from Father M. George to all my friends and the academic fraternity from different departments and schools. Thank you very much for being with us today to flag off this academic program in this building, and we hope to have more such products. Thank you very much.
To the Director of Kerala Council of Historical Research to offer the chair's remark.
Thank you so much. I wish to formally thank the IUCSSRE, MG University, and also right at the outset thank Professor Sanal Mohan, who was the previous director of KCHR. And it was when he was the director that the initial invitation to Dr. Varghese was made to come as scholar in residence to Trivandrum. We are very grateful that Dr. Varghese could finally make it this time, and we could hold this sort of residency in the way in which it ought to be done, which is without interruptions from COVID and without other kinds of delays and disruptions. So we are very happy that we can actually collaborate in this fashion with such an important University of Kerala. Now, Professor Sethi has actually said many things that I would have said, so I'm not going to waste your time by repeating all of that. I just want to tell you a little bit about why it is important to have discussions about both contemporary and historical issues in this fashion, in an interdisciplinary fashion, and for us to actually collaborate in this fashion. I think we are living through a time when these discussions are being closed down increasingly in different parts of the country. We know this. When differing views are being shut down as quickly as they're voiced. We are also living through a time when young students are increasingly under threat for expressing their views and opinions and ideas and their voices in dissent. It is a shocking reality in this country today that one of the large constituencies of people who have been put into jails are actually young students. So therefore, we hope that a collaboration of this kind, which actually generates, I hope, very serious, reflective discussion on an important and significant topic such as migration. I had in our previous public lecture, the scholar in residence has an obligation to do 2 public lectures. The first public lecture was actually held in Trivandrum. This is Dr. Varghese's second lecture. I had said at that point, that it is of immense importance to actually discuss an issue like migration. Migration is probably one of the most significant issues in the world today, not just the country. So we have a scholar who has spent decades specializing on this area. We are very fortunate to have him with us. We are very fortunate that we could actually bring the workshop to Kottayam, and that we can get students from all over and young scholars from all over the country to come and participate in this ongoing discussion. So thank you so much, Professor Sethi, for having immediately, as soon as I called him, he said, yes, please come and do it here. So I'm very grateful to Professor Sethi for having agreed immediately for hosting this workshop. And it doesn't require me to remind us today that some of the most poignant cases of migration that we're seeing in the world, caused by war, caused by hunger, caused by political changes, caused by economic deprivation, all manners of crises leads to migration, leads to displacement. There is a huge amount of internal displacement in this country alone. One of those stories is what Varghese has been tracking in a very careful and detailed manner for the past 2 decades. I think it's extremely important to understand detailed historical research. Without that, generalizations sometimes, I feel, and increasingly in these times, are made too readily. I think it's important to actually work with local detail so that we can actually flesh out the kinds of issues that are at stake when we speak about something as important and significant as migration. So with these few words, thank you so much for having us here, Professor Sethi, and thank you so much, Dr. Varghese, for having agreed, and also to University of Hyderabad for having given you leave so that you could come and join us as scholar in residence. On behalf of KCHR, on behalf of the previous director, our present chairperson, Professor Michael Taragan, and myself and all our colleagues, we thank you for having us here, and we hope that the workshop will be a great success. Thank you so much.
Professor Sethi, Professor Vijay Varghese, friends, ladies and gentlemen. The inaugural lecture of a Young Scholars Workshop on migration. This is a very welcome, very apt thing for me, because I started my research career long ago by studying migration, that too from the Travancore region to the Malabar region. But there are other aspects which also makes me extremely happy and proud to address this gathering on this particular occasion. There are 3 aspects converging in this hall of this academic complex, which is also appropriately called Convergence. First of all, I should also claim, because this is only a claim, not any effort at identifying myself as an honor, no question of ownership at all. But I was one of the colleagues of your former Vice Chancellor and now Vice Chairman of the Kerala Council of Higher Education, Professor Rajan Gurukal, who thought of this kind of a building, and also the academic processes which went behind that. We were not alone. Professor Rajan Varghese, there were others from this university, there were others from outside too, including of all the people I should not be forgetting, Professor K.N. Panikar, who was very emphatic upon the idea of a converging academic complex, which he thought that MG University will be able to provide for the whole Indian academic community. And I'm happy to be present on this occasion when I believe this is possibly the first time that you are, after moving into this place, that you are holding a function like this. My congratulations and best wishes to Professor CD and all his colleagues and all of you who are here. I hope this building and this forum will provide further opportunities for the kind of convergence that we all hoped for in the beginning and we are still hoping for. Along with that, there is also the fact that there is a collaborative element to this between the Kerala Council for Historical Research, of which I am also associated with, and the Inter-University Center for Social Science Research and Extension. The collaboration is been going on in different aspects of the working of the KCHR, and we are very, very happy. We are very, very obliged to the MG University as well as the faculty and director of the Inter-University Center for agreeing to this kind of a collaborative function. I hope this collaboration will also, in its own right, grow biggest, and benefit a large number of scholars in the making, scholars who are already established, etc., etc. Now, I wouldn't go into the details of the kind of collaboration that we could be aiming at. That I'm sure that in the course of the next few days, you will be discussing that aspect too. Now, in this context, I should be failing in my duty if I don't mention the role that the School of Social Sciences of the MG University has played in the creation of this concept, as well as the creation of this kind of an atmosphere, an ambience in which this could be arranged. I am part of the School of Social Sciences. At the age of 52, I decided one morning to resign from academic activities and return to my village in an island. And I was mainly engaged in agricultural activities. Then Professor Rajan Gurukal, who was the director of the School of Social Sciences, located me and asked me to come and take a few lectures, and I was paid something like, I think, 450 rupees per lecture or something. Anyway, I got I was assigned as a visiting professor or visiting lecturer or something. But I tell you, I thoroughly enjoyed those. I served at least for more than 2 years, I think. I was timing my arrival here. This morning also I come from the same island. After crossing the backwaters, it took me today slightly less than an hour. But in those days I used to drive in my Maruti car, and that took me only 45 minutes. So I don't know how I managed to come at a shorter time. Anyway, this route has become so imprinted on my mind, so I didn't require any directions. Now, I had Sanal Mohan and myself were colleagues in your School of Social Sciences. There were others too. I'm not going to go into but tell me, allow me to tell you something about the School of Social Sciences, as well as the person who is going to give you the public lecture today. One day I decided to survey the most senior professors of the best known, at that time the best known Department of History in Kerala. That was of course the Calicut University History Department. I wouldn't say the names, but I'm sure that you all know the names. Every one of them, I asked them, whom do you think, as your old students in your department, have done truly well as historians, as scholars? They had no doubt, and I asked them independently, they had no doubt in who they were. And I've got great pride in citing and saying their names here. One, of course, is Professor Sanal Mohan. They all agreed that he was one of the best. But they also prefaced it by saying a person who was no more with us. That was Professor Murali, who was also in the School of Social Sciences. A brilliant scholar. Most of you may not be knowing him, but a tremendously brilliant scholar. Then, of course, the two others, and among the other two, there was, of course, Professor Francis, who is now in the faculty of Kaladi Shankaracharya University, and, of course, Dr. Varghese, whose lecture I have the pleasure and happiness to inaugurate today. Now, first of all, the collaboration, the natural kind of alliance between the School of Social Sciences and the Inter-University Center, I hope will continue, and I hope that it will benefit people more. Along with that, as I said, I've got great pleasure and happiness in inaugurating the public lecture to be delivered by Dr. Varghese. It happened to be my topic. I want to say that my with a quotation, because I started, as I told you earlier, I started my research career. Not exactly the research career, but I first registered myself for a PhD in the Kerala University, and I had 4 case studies, and I was working under the supervision of Professor K. Marthandavarma at the Alua Union Christian College. The case studies he approved of when it was on peasant movements in Kerala. The other case studies he approved of, but one. The one which he was not very sure about, was about the migration of peasants or farmers from one part of Kerala to the other. He told me at that time that it is better that you go to an institute which has got demographers and economists who can guide you. And as he had told me, I shifted to the Center for Development Studies, not on my own. They allowed me to come there, and I went down in the academic hierarchy. Practically, I had to go down from PhD to MPhil. It was my MPhil thesis. Now, this MPhil thesis came out of my own understanding, what I understood from listening to people. I had absolutely no training in research. I had absolutely no training in how to write footnotes. In fact, that was the most intriguing thing. I could see that, people writing big papers with large number of footnotes. And the first assignment I gave to Professor K.N. Raj, the famous economist, he literally threw it on my face, saying that there is no notes, no. So I asked him that, why notes? Why do you want all the notes? These are things which I know. But he said that only you know, or you have come to know. But that was the beginning of the learning of how to do research under the guidance of one of the greatest scholars that India had produced at the time. And for me, therefore, that scheme of studies are part of my own making of my own career, my later positions that I've acquired and all that. Now, coming to think of the kinds of work that's going on in the area of migration, not only people moving from one place to another, but in that process, how they depend on various kind of resources, both physical as well as non-physical, and how they converge in understanding the rest of the world through the eyes of a person who is on the move. To me, what was quite striking, which is still quite striking, was the encounter with the people who moved from Travancore, then Tiruvidankur, to Malabar, and their encounter with the Adivasi groups of people, the kind of tribal people with a tribal understanding. The tribal understanding, I'm putting it in very broad terms, was where a group of people who believed that their own ancestors were in that earth, were in the land where they were living. For them, that land cannot be parted with. While the people who were on the move, for them, they had a philosophy, they had a worldview, they had a, one could even put it in quotes, an ideology, that you can move anywhere in the world. You can carry the pictures of Jesus, his mother, and saints with you, and you can move anywhere in the world. So obviously there was a contrast between the two, and this contrast, of course, has unleashed several kinds of submerged kind of feelings, and I'm sure that those issues have been well studied by Varghese, because after a while I could literally see Varghese blossoming himself into an expert, and now I'm so familiar with Varghese's work that I wouldn't make any comment on that. I would only say that I recommend Varghese and his work as a model for young scholars who are going to attend the workshop in the coming days. I wish you all the best, and I wish Dr. Varghese very beneficial interaction, and I inaugurate this series of the workshop and also the inaugural lecture. Thank you.
Now I invite Dr. Vijay Varghese to deliver the public lecture.
And off the dais, and dear friends, thank you all for coming. Let me thank the KCHR right at the beginning for inviting me under this program called Scholar in Residence, which allowed me to speak today to you, and also to have the workshop that we are starting tomorrow. I'm particularly thankful to Professor Tharagan, Professor Sanil Mohan, and Professor Arunima for making this possible. My special thanks also to Professor Sethi for co-hosting this event, and the colleagues at IUCSSRE at Kottayam for smoothly conducting and this session. I've been working on this peasant migration to Malabar, predominantly by Syrian Christian peasants, starting from the 1920s to 1970s. And when I started working on this, obviously Professor Tharagan's work is a kind of work that you cannot bypass, right? He has done his pioneering MPhil dissertation at CDS. Subsequently, he has published a paper out of that in Economic and Political Weekly, and also another paper in the Journal of Kerala Studies. So we always start with Tharagan's work, and whatever I do subsequently, Professor Tharagan's work is always a presence in the work. Today, what I'm trying to do is to engage with the seeming anachronism of deploying spiritual renderings in the service of material gain and attaching sacrality to modern secular material transformations. And I'm going to specifically look at this issue by looking at the histories and discourses produced by particularly the Syrian Catholic migrant imagination on the subject. And I would like to demonstrate how religious and theological dispositions, both in explicit as well as implicit ways, shored up enterprises of land reclamation and agrarian expansion in modern Kerala. At the same time, these discourses produced a wider moral economy of salvaging wilderness to a new cosmos of development and prosperity. I'd also would like to delve a bit into the estrangements within the Christian world along this mission, driving two Catholic denominations into conflict for authority and identity. And this history, I hope, will allow us to complicate the material-spiritual binary and allow us to see the adaptive functions they perform in constituting interstices and demonstrate that the secular material is not always deprived of a sense of sacred and its moralities. As we know, a long-held religious imagination, as represented by the mythological story of Keralopathy, attributes the creation of Kerala to the Hindu god Lord Parashurama. According to this elite historical consciousness of the region, Parashurama levitated the landmass of Kerala out of the Arabian Sea and conferred it to the Brahmins for want of absolving his sin of killing the Kshatriyas. And this myth informs and resonates in the collective consciousness of Keralites as a distinctive community in significant ways even today, with its insistent presence in the public memory of Kerala. But at the same time, this relentless reproduction of this myth is coincided by an equally powerful articulations that debunks this myth. Say, for instance, writing in 1967 in a Christian magazine called Giridevam, which was a mouthpiece of the Syro-Malabar Catholic Diocese of Tilicherry, Joseph Nedungundam, who was a migrant to the Malabar, lamented at the outlandish distinction ascribed to Kerala by this origin myth, which according to him deny all of its people an equal claim and belonging to their homeland. To Nedungunnam, the obscurantist socio-political imagination disconnected the region from a global historical time, and its historical praxis promoted exclusivist distribution of resources as against a universalist vision of God that he believes in. And he writes, I quote, "When the whole world was created by God for all human beings, Kerala was created by Parashurama for Brahmins. And in consequence, majority of the land is in the hands of Devasams and Brahmasams." And this situation, according to him, quote again, disallowed the hardworking people, read the Syrian Christian settlers to Malabar and elsewhere, to make use of the land for the progress of the nation. And he was firm in his conviction that this was an act against the justice of God, done in the name of God. And Nedunkunnam's enunciation skillfully, as we see just now, ensembles a modern ethic of hard work, an ideology of agrarian expansion as against an exclusive possession of land without being used, and the spirit of capitalist accumulation through a skillful invocation of the justice of God and the duty to the nation or country at a time when agrarian expansion to the unoccupied areas has been at the center of the developmentalist dreams of the state in general and the community of Syrian Christians in particular. Now, Nedunkunnam's evocation of God and the morality of dutiful citizenship with regard to land colonization and agrarian expansion in modern Kerala, in a sense affirms the continuing impinging of the affect renderings into the domain of secular material. Modern secular age, as it developed in the West, is said to presuppose a division between immanent or material from the transcendent or religious, and the independence of the former from the latter. However, modernity as an inseparable process of disenchantment between the spiritual and the material did fall by wayside even in the West. Leave aside the mediated secular and modern in the erstwhile colonies like India. As Charles Taylor has subsequently reasoned, the establishment of the science-driven immanent frame did not inescapably drive people to a state of mandatory unbelief. Often, acceptance of a scientific view of the world, even as a belief in the existence and affectivity of transcendence, coincided in the modern secular. Moreover, the continued salience of pre-modern in quote, in the modern in the form of seemingly obsolete imaginations and religious rationalities, Taylor argues, may not always be conservative in their import. The invocation of such affects often presupposes a sense of normative order and moral economy from where one could engage and resist some of the threatening realities of modernity, as well as reinforce the modern through seemingly devious convictions. And this uneasy composition of Indian modern imagination of nation, in a sense, has been well articulated by Partha Chatterjee. For him, we know the outer inner domain dichotomy that Partha Chatterjee has posited. So the embracing of immanent frame and acceptance of the scientific understanding of the universe, hence, is accompanied by an ostensibly incompatible belief in the transcendent, as Sudipta Kaviraj has said. Now, the inconsistency of this assemblage has been resolved by a skillful separation of spheres within, wherein a rational worldview is adhered to in the office, in the material life, in research, and so on, and the irrational is allowed expression in the sphere containing domestic traditions, religions, etc. Now, my attempt today, alongside disproving this larger, complete disenchantment thesis, engage with the idea of disembedded domains within the ensemble of Indian modern and reveal how the spiritual and the material domains are often traversed in interesting ways of transaction. Apart from mobilizing spiritual forces and emotions in the service of the immanent, the materialistic transformation itself is posited as sacred, as the historical experience of the agrarian migration, particularly the migration to Malabar, is understood by the dominant Syrian Christian imagination. And such apparently anachronistic invocations at large and intersections within the Indian modern unmask the historical contingency involved in the separation of life worlds on the one hand, and also how rewarding they are in the transformative goals and moral validations of change on the other. Now, the urge for progress in Nedungundam and exasperation at the hindrances to it alluded to the futuristic aspirations of the migrant subject, apart from a palpable entanglement of the patriotic or political and the religious, contrary to the foundational disenchantment of the Western modernity. And Nedungundam repudiates the existent cosmologies in search of a modern cosmological rationality that suits an emergent economic choice and calls equal and impartial claims to everyone on the God-given natural world. Now, before getting into this story, let me first turn into the historical context that spawned migrations and land reclamation in the present day Kerala. Kerala's economic modernity, as all of us know, with this very sluggish modern industrial development, had been marked by extensive land reclamation for cultivation. And Travancore was the prime site of this transformation. The British, by design, hollowed the crown of Travancore to serve their interests before integrating the local economy with the global capitalism, and also for using its landscape for producing for the global market. I'm speaking about the plantation economy, which was made in Travancore with the support of the Travancore state, which was subordinated completely to the British and European interests. Apace with this subordination, Travancore responded to the perilous situation by finding ways to make use of the predicament by a selective appropriation of the promulgated economic model. From its part, it encouraged local population to cultivate for the world market in their own land, for their own benefit and for their own progress, and conferring full ownership rights to the tenant cultivators of the government land through the Partum Proclamation in 1865 was an outstanding step in this regard, which not only created present proprietors, but also it incentivized individual initiatives, but at the same time opened up potentially all landscape in Travancore for colonization, alongside making land a valued asset as well as a marketable commodity. Consequently, an enterprising section of the local population began to view plantation agriculture as a profitable option, and their increasing participation turned out to be significant enough to challenge the so-called British planters' Raj, as Paul Rigbach has called it, which is to the later half of the 19th century. By early 20th century itself, the British planters' Raj was challenged by the native planters. The local Syrian Christian community proved to be more entrepreneurial in this regard, aspiring and diligent than other communities. And they led this transition with their resourcefulness, experience, etc., particularly gained through working in plantations set up by the Europeans. Now, it was also accentuated by the collapse of the native state, particularly the demilitarization of Travancore, and a British-dominated commercial system dislodged Syrian Christians from their conventional economic niche, forcing them to look for newer economic choices and enabling them to recreate the community around the sites of land and labor by profitably making use of the new public sphere, wherein the dominance of the British and European planters was challenged with a nationalistic shibboleth, our land for ourselves. The entry of rubber into the plantation scene at this stage, with the possibility of establishing small holdings with limited investment of capital and labor, spawned massive participation in the enterprise of land reclamation for agriculture. Forests, hills, slopes, and wastelands were reclaimed in a big way and altered not only for commercial agriculture but also for food crop cultivation, at least from the 1920s onwards, in the context of economic problems as well as food scarcity. And the economic depression of the 1930s has accelerated this process. And the demographic transition of Travancore and the stagnation of rice production forced the princely state to import rice and paddy, turning Travancore, which was once exporting rice, into a rice importing region, and more than half of the funds that Travancore was spending by 1930s was spent on importing rice. The cessation of rice import during the Second World War, particularly after the fall of Burma, led to the Grow More Food program, allowing peasants to cultivate forests and wastelands in an attempt to tide over this food scarcity. And this gave, of course, further fillip to land colonization. And as per the government statistics itself, by 1951, 98.1% of the total area available for cultivation came to, available for occupation came to cultivation in the princely state. And once the land in the central and eastern regions of Travancore got exhausted, and in parallel, the Syrian Christians, mostly Syrian Christians, small farmers, mostly targeted Malabar, where almost half of the area was available for occupation. And once Malabar got slackened, and they began to, target areas beyond Malabar. Now, migrations for agricultural expansion in consequence, as a result of this historical process, emerged as the most preferred model for development and progress at this stage, with a conforming social imaginary which buttressed it. Between 1930s and 1960s, migration and agriculture expansion had been discussed widely as a major solution for food scarcity, economic crisis, population growth, etc. And migration to not only Malabar, migration to states like Madhya Pradesh and even to countries like Brazil and other Latin American countries were just not mooted but then actively discussed in the public, in the Syrian Christian public. On the course of this discussion, even traditionally affluent communities turned to a conviction that any community that refuses to migrate would not progress anywhere at any time. I'm basically quoting Manat Padmanabhan. Needless to say, this social imaginary, while elevating the migrant settlers in the undomesticated spaces as progressive citizens, hardly conceded any space for the concerns of ecology and the original inhabitants of this reclaimed land. And over the course of this 5 decades between 1920 and 1970s, the so-called empty and forsaken areas of Malabar were transformed into rich agricultural settlements and a network of towns, providing the Syrian Christian settlers a new subjectivity of development as a progressive peasant community with a specific authority over the modernity of Kerala. And a section of the Syrian Christians were even unenthusiastic about the movement for United Kerala, as being part of the Madras state meant more land available for reclamation within their own state. Now, the Syrian Christian church also reached Malabar along with the migrants, if not, slightly later to migrants, if not along with them. And the church made steadfast progress after reaching the interiors of Malabar with the migrant settlers and articulated this enterprise of land reclamation as an as in Christian idioms. The Syrian Christian narratives, particularly produced by ecclesiastics as well as the laity, in the form of autobiographies, memories, fictional writings, articles in the contemporary, church publications, souvenirs, etc., have painted this migration to Malabar as a heavenly revealed and guided affair. And we know that impairing progressive disenchantment rational, Christian thought had been called upon to serve the ideology of capital and development in the West as well, be it the exposure of industrial capitalism or for vindicating the ideologies of improvement in the field of agriculture. But in the case of Malabar, a parallel is often drawn with the scriptural exodus of the Israelites from Egypt to Palestine, from the land of persecution and slavery to that of milk and honey. Sebastian Vallopalli, the first bishop of the Diocese of Tillicherry, Syro-Malabar Diocese of Tillicherry, designated the migrants as the dear children of God and the new Israelites. His own journey to Malabar from Pala in Travancore was illustrated as a story of Exodus, while the new story of Exodus was bound to become a fetish through persistent reproduction of this sort of a narrative. Vallopalli was exalted as a father of migrants and described variously as the Moses of Malabar for leading them to Malabar, and sometimes also to biblical Joshua, who helped the Israelites to settle down in the Canaan and helped them to grow as a people. The exodus to Malabar too is recollected as a miraculous escape from slavery, oppression and poverty to a land of promises. However, as we know, unlike the biblical Canaan, a land of milk and honey was not readily available there in Malabar. Instead, it was set somewhere in the future. Malabar is said as endowed with all God-given riches, which was enough to convert this land into a land of milk and honey, a Canaan. So Canaan was deferred, was a kind of a deferred promise, and God has put together this chosen people to actualize this. Now, an anthropocentric view of the world with a kind of universal application coincides with a narrative particularity, taking it beyond the local and regional story and placing Malabar within an all-embracing canopy. And in this imagination, the earth is imagined as created by God specifically for human being, with a considered duties entrusted on mankind by the Creator in return. The earth is gift of God to all humanity, and it is the birthright of all born human beings to live and thrive on the earth. Hence, migrations are godly endorsed mechanism of demographic adjustment across the world. I'm again quoting from the articles in Giridipam, Satyadipam, Deepika, etc. The earth as a purposive creation is presented as capable of providing everything that mankind wants and to be made use of imaginatively for personal well-being and that of the world. And this is expected from man, who is endowed with the ability to do so by the God. And narratives often invokes the commandment of the God to condemn that, quote, those who keep the earth without cultivating it are sinners, as they let the society starve. God did not intend starvation and death, which is the result of a thankless humanity. Also, the narratives allude God leaving the man the responsibility of completing the act of creation. Human beings are said to have invested with the divine duty of discovering and tapping the resources inherent in the nature to give the act of creation its perfection as desired by the Creator. And the failure to honor this obligation is against the law of nature and a dereliction of duty, and therefore is punishable. Father Joseph Vadakan, who championed the cause of migrant settlers, we know, in the anti-eviction movement, the very existence of wild forest with full of woods, thickets, cobras, etc., epitomizes the incompleteness of the world. And he confesses in retrospect that to make the imperfect world beautiful and rich, God showered skills and dexterity on man, gave him the capability to convert wild forests into paradise. Clearing forest is thus a part of a courageous migratory enterprise across the world and across time. And the general call was to convert the thorn-producing spaces of woods and thickets into cultivation and not even a needle space of soil be left out of the custody of humankind as uncultivated. The schematics of narratives thus invest man, whom God wanted to be fruitful and to multiply, with the duty of executing the divine plan. Now, this mission of creating a worldly paradise is impossible without replenishing and subduing the earth and occupying the empty and void spaces. And it is with such a worldview the narratives questions the terrestrial kingdoms that put restrictions on occupying these so-called empty and void spaces, contrary to the sanctions of the Creator, who wanted man to reside all over the earth. Right? Now, as alluded already, the Christian obligation of subduing the earth and bringing it under the cultivation often merges with a patriotic responsibility of producing for the nation in order to free it from hunger. And Giridibam, the mouthpiece of Tillicherry Syro-Malabar diocese, perfectly reflects these interconnections in its adage, which is for the God and for the country. Hard work on the earth is revealed as a perfect way of meeting this dual obligation of the citizen believer. Migrations to underdeveloped countries are invoked as solutions to resolve poverty. And yes, adulation of the builders of this worldly paradise and prosperous nation was accompanied by criticism to the unpatriotic and unjust and malevolent attitude of the state and other adversaries towards these chosen ones. And similarly, appreciation of hard work aimed at converting this spacious and void earth into a new Malabar is accompanied by a strong disapproval of lethargy, which was seen as a true violation of God's commandment. Those who remain indolent, I quote, therefore, need to answer to God, for lethargy can only cause malice to the family and the community and enhance the number of beggars. Now, the change on the secular material plane also shoulders sacrality in certain other ways, through ways of moralizing the transformation in search of ethical acquiescence for the same. Special moral economies of truths with normative meanings were constructed, often by remarkably ingenious usage of categories. In the case of Malabar, it assumed an imaginative juxtaposition of geographical categories that condenses specific meanings in a dichotomy to legitimize change. What underwrites geography as an imagined sense of place are claims over meaning and the contestations and struggle to dominate. The categories of wilderness and civility are part of such a constructed modern ordering. Hans-Peter Dürr elucidated that the dichotomous postulation had compelling political functions to perform in justifying the self and bringing the other under subjugation. Resonating this sort of a characteristic modernist imagination of positing civility against the wilderness, the narratives of Malabar migration, the Syrian Christian narratives of Malabar migration, hinge upon the conversion of a geographical entity which is portrayed as lifeless into a location of life, an industry at the cost of enormous suffering and sacrifices. Self-articulation, such self-articulation centered the toiling man who gives his life and blood to this redemptive mission, even as it clears ground for new coercive power and governmentalities. As we know, the colonizing West wasn't free from its ambivalence towards tropical wilderness. It was seen simultaneously as a threat as well as a resource for the civilization. An undesirable space that threatens the agents of modernity on the one hand, and a site of enormously untapped wealth on the other. So subduing or extracting the wilderness became a solution to this problem, which also allowed British to underline their difference and undertake a civilizing pursuit endowed with adventure, courage, industriousness, and hard work. European planting enterprises, for instance, in the tropical high ranges were accordingly portrayed as restoring wilderness to its life. I'm basically referring to some of these accounts by the early planters in Travancore itself. It was capable of sucking the lifeblood out of anybody who dared to confront it. It was said to be covered with impassable forest, wild animals, and life-taking diseases. Its soil remained under the shade of thick bamboo forests and gigantic trees for centuries without a chance of seeing the sunlight. An indomitable landscape of feral forests with full of wild animals like elephants, tigers, etc., etc. It was also infested with life-taking malaria, killing hundreds and hundreds of pioneering migrants. And malaria was described as the biggest enemy of migrants in Malabar. And just like trees shedding the leaves at the beginning of the summer season, the migrants were perishing to malaria, said some of the narratives. And there were many instances in which entire family perishing to malaria, leaving none behind. Horror of the encounter was confirmed by the non-settlers' discourses as well. Say, for instance, the Serve India Society's report on the life of migrants in Malabar. Also, the orphanages run by Latin Catholics in Malabar had to admit increased number of orphaned children are all being cited to underscore the horror of the situation. Now, so Malabar as a result was a ferocious landscape, right? So the ferocious landscape of Malabar as a wilderness was accompanied by an admission of its potentialities as well. The hills and forests of Malabar were said to have the capacity to become Kerala's meadows of prosperity. It could be turned into a paradise if these unrewarding forests were destroyed and replaced with high-yielding trees and plants. The potential paradise elated the migrants at the first sight as virgin soil waiting for assiduous and hardworking sons of the soil. The untapped riches latent in the Malabar wilderness is said to have the capacity to convert the misery into happiness and opulence with just application of human labor. The narratives places the hardworking and forward-looking migrant subject at the center of this transformation again, who was chosen the awful forests and valleys as their battlefields. So the motto of work hard and live with dignity assumed an impeccable value, if you look at these narratives very closely, and was stated to have carried always the blessings of God. The courage and spirit of adventure of the migrant subject in their struggle against wilderness is greatly impressed even by the natives. Now, if you look at the narratives, they are packed with absorbing instances of heroism, gruesome encounters with animals, nature, all these kinds of stories are making these narratives very, very thick, right? The narratives were in general subsumed into a discourse of idleness and lack of foresight. The natives were basically accorded into such a discourse of idleness and lack of foresight, while the elite natives were seen as living in feudal pride without the spirit of accumulation and knowledge of agriculture. Adivasis of the land were looked down upon as untouched by the virtues of systematic labor and civilization. The difference of the migrant subject, articulated in terms of hard work, adventure, methods of agriculture, as I have already said, and industriousness, was to accentuate their civilizational proclivities. A subjectivity textured around such positive attributes for progressive ends like augmenting agriculture production, preventing food shortage, and thereby nutritional diseases and deaths, creating employment, disseminating the ethic of labor, reclaiming the land, all this rationalized the conversion of wilderness into an ordered, productive space. And these are the new moralities of, other moralities of converting these empty spaces into productive locations. The settler warriors were proclaimed as our national assets, as they made hitherto untaken terrains yield not only for themselves but also for the country. So the moral authority of these agents of change are fortified as they are seen as embarking on a mission of development when the government failed to discharge its primary responsibility of providing to eat, dress and live to the citizen. Right? And there are other arguments as well. It is not only just satisfying hunger, but also Adivasis were brought into civilization. They were made into wage laborers, proletarization process, etc. Right? Also, the political significance of migration gained currency much beyond the migrant self-narratives, galvanizing the integration of the otherwise divided Malayalam-speaking region. Say, for instance, S.K. Pottekad, while writing his Vishakanyaka in 1948, said that the agency of these Travancore brethren is commendable in carving out, knowingly or unknowingly, the first steps of a united Kerala. So the migrants thus were on a mission of bridging the civilizational gap between Travancore and Malabar, according to these narratives, and contributing to their unification and to consolidating their development. And the settlers of Malabar were not just hardworking people, but carriers of a superior civilization as well. They reclaimed the locations of serpent groves, the locations of gauze, the locations of evil spirits to a rational space of production. Right? The region moved from darkness to light, from wickedness to morality, and from fear to valor, unquote. The spread of education to the interiors of Malabar through a network of schools and colleges set up by the migrant community too provided grounds for further morally accentuating the migration. And it was under the weight of such a moral economy, with its emotively defined truths of altruism, that migrant narratives present rather romanticized and one-dimensional reconfiguration of Malabar with objects of modernity, civilization and urbanity. Thomas Parayaparambil is very, very euphoric about this change. I quote, "The places where wild animals and malaria had free sport were altered into sanctum sanctorum of scientific knowledge, civilization and blooming groves by migrants. Thus, by changing the facade of Malabar, they have created a new sky, a new earth over there." And Father Vadakan was saying that Mount Sion could be rejoicing by seeing this change, seeing this creation of this promised land through hard work. Now, there were also attempts to construct the figure of a migrant unambiguously as a virtuous and righteous figure. A closer reading of some of these novels written by the migrants themselves. I'm particularly referring to 3 novels, one by somebody called Thomas Varghese, namely Churam, and other 2 by somebody called Kuruvelangad Joseph, namely Dukka Bhumi and Chuli. Both of them were basically migrant settlers as well. And these literary self-descriptions are textured around the Syrian Christian peasant migration to Malabar, and were political articulations written in the 1960s and 70s. Political articulations necessitated by a historical context defined by a burgeoning sense of cynicism towards the model of migration and land reclamation. By 1960s, there is a growing sense of ecological consciousness. There are also attempts on the part of the state to evict the government, evict the migrants from many locations in Travancore as well as in Malabar. Now, it was compounded by several attempts on the part of government to evict the migrants. So, a consequent discursive matrix of tussle with countervailing discourses of celebrations as well as denunciation are implicated in the discursive universe of these popular novels that these migrants have written. At a time when representations of unethical migrants motivated by greed, aggression, and excess circulated in the discursive world, or began to circulate in the discursive world, these texts ventured to construct a virtuous and righteous migrant as the real against its own other. The opposite of the real migrant, interestingly, belongs to the same community of migrants themselves, but he is a deceptive and diabolic figure. He is depicted as one who considers acquisition of wealth as the ultimate goal of life and stretches himself to any extent of impiety to accomplish that. This may be seen as a self-admission of the migrant imagination designed to reinforce the righteous ideal, the pristine against the unreal fraudulent. However, I'm not getting into the narrative details of this story for want of time. But however, the migrant moral universe did not allow misdeeds of these fraudulent migrants to go unpunished. Some of them are portrayed as being reduced to poverty eventually, poverty and grief. Some of them get caught by the police for their misdeeds and duplicity. Some of them they're forced to commit suicide. Some of them get dispossessed of all their wealth and property. Some of them slipping into insanity and so on, right? The principle that God would certainly destroy the greedy and death is the punishment to the sinner get a kind of fictional endorsement here. And such punishment, as I said, often is enunciated in the language of a divinely programmed retribution. The narratives pronounce the penalty for the unpardonable mistakes inside the plot itself, leaving perhaps nothing to be done outside the text. Even serious structural maladies thus get rectified through a divine intervention or through the heroics of a God-fearing protagonist. Nevertheless, there are instances where crimes go unpunished, apparently leaving fissures in the moral universe of the migrant. Say, for instance, in Dukkha Bhumi, which was the earliest novel written among these three, unlike other novels, makes room for transgressions that would, in the migrant code of morality, otherwise generate severe heavenly retribution, and thus leaving a space for its resolution outside the narrative. The vicious characters like Aukaraji, Kachipura Mattai Chetan, Osili, which is a stand-in for Mantha Padmanabhan, the NSS leader, were thus left with no punishment for their misdeeds. Instead, they grow in influence and power. Now, as I said, Dukkha Bhumi is the first among these three novels, and arguably that novel seeks punishment to sins and justice to victims outside the narrative. Unsurprisingly, Dukkha Bhumi ends with a resounding call to the migrant peasants to conquer fear, unite against anti-peasant policies of the government and ill-treatment by the landlords, and muster power for safeguarding themselves and ensuring well-being. The narrative seems to be confident of wresting divine retribution for the ability of human agency to fight for reversing the slithering fortunes into the advantage of the migrant subjects. But however, by the time the other two novels were written, Churam and Chulli, though most of the eviction attempts were not successful, the discursive terrain turned strongly antagonistic to the model of migration and agricultural expansion at the cost of depletion of natural wealth. Right? As time was turning hostile, the narratives in the later novels resorted to a stronger reinforcement of the notion of divine justice and retribution. Now let me come to the last part of this presentation, which is about the conflict within the Christian Catholic groups. The language of a Christian theology, with its claim to universal application and morality, disappear when it comes to the repossession of the religious geography of Malabar, as one could see in the Syrian Catholic antagonism towards Latin Catholics. The Syrian Catholic narratives confront the Latin Catholic Diocese of Calicut on the question of jurisdiction, when allegedly the latter sought to thwart the attempts aimed at establishing a Syrian Catholic Syro-Malabar diocese in Malabar. The underlying antagonism towards Latin establishment, underscored, of course, by the ethnic caste divergences, through a claim of difference and by invoking the fundamental principle of pluralities within Catholicism. Sebastian Vallopalli, the first bishop of the newly formed Tilicheri Syro-Malabar diocese, found that the Latins began to resist the Syrian diocese of Malabar as soon as the idea was mooted. He charges the Latin diocese of persuading the Syrian migrants from Travancore to embrace Latin rite by insisting upon the sameness of the Catholic faith and denouncing the idea as a potential source of discord among the faithful. Varghese Marudananguri, writing in the 1950s, suggested that once their spiritual disability is solved, all other disabilities could be solved, and they will lead automatically to their prosperity. The Syrian leadership in Travancore, Cochin mainland was lambasted for disregarding the fellow Christians who were forced to settle in a foreign land, and reminded of that they wouldn't be a more rueful situation than being ignored by one's brethren in a state of despondency. The appeals of the migrants for upholding their individual ritual identity was heeded gradually by the Holy See. A certain number of Syrian priests were allowed in Malabar in the beginning, from the mid-1940s onwards, and finally a separate Syrian Catholic diocese, Syro-Malabar diocese for the migrants, was established, instituted, with its headquarters in Telicheri, as I said, in 1953. Sebastian Vallopalli, a priest from the Christian heartland of Travancore, Cochin, was chosen to lead the new diocese, and a sustained campaign was begun to mobilize resources for the new diocese. A Tilicheri diocese fund was constituted, to which Syrian Catholic Christians contributed generously, cherishing the expanding national boundaries of Kerala Nasrani community. Appeals for help were even often quoted Cardinal Tisserand, Cardinal Eugene Tisserand basically, who was instrumental in sanctioning the new diocese, seeking ritual solidarity. And Cardinal Tisserand apparently said, "I have done my part in erecting the new diocese. All the Syrian dioceses have now should bring it up." After taking charge as administrative apostolic, Sebastian Vallopalli wrote an emotional request for help to the Syrian Catholics in the heartland for their own brethren, helpless but determined to live as good Catholics with pride, reminding them of their collective responsibility to nurture the new diocese. Efforts to nurture the new diocese by evoking the ritual comprador and cultural lineage was accompanied by deteriorating relationship with the Diocese of Calicut and the Latin establishment. Recounting the bitterness, Mar Sebastian Vallopalli, even as late as 2003, narrates the manifold hurdles created on his path and the lukewarm attitude of the Latin establishment of Calicut. However, he was still appreciative about Bishop Patroni, though, who apparently has reported correct statistics to the Holy See. Vallopalli also see a Latin hand behind the decision of the bulk of the Syrian priests who were sent from Travancore, Cochin area to serve the migrants in Malabar, to remain in Calicut diocese, to retain their affiliation with the Latin Catholic diocese. And the bishop was contemptuous of the Latinists for their malevolent propaganda against Cardinal Tisserand as well, whom he considered the main force behind making Tilicheri diocese a reality. Tisserand belonged to the Latin rite but was stated to be a true friend of Syrian rite because he himself put repeatedly, I quote, "I love your church because I know her history," as against the Latin Catholics whom he considered as, quote, "the sons of fishermen, a Portuguese product." The Latin group turned hostile as a result, and the Holy See found itself flooded with incessant petitions against Cardinal Tisserand between 1956 and 59, which ultimately forced Pope to transfer him from the charge of Oriental Congregation to that of the Vatican Library. Now, the clash of the two different rights over the Syrian Catholic migrants of Malabar was, of course, not without diplomatic exchanges of mutual love, magnanimity, and support. But such gestures were inadequate to sufficiently obscure their motives. The formation of Tilicherry diocese in Malabar, with a priest from the Heartland as its head, was seen as equivalent to a recovery of a lost world. The words of Bishop Wiley, who was the Metropolitan of Pala at that point in time, in his farewell message to the administrator designate and others who are moving to Malabar, actually tells this. I quote him: "Friends, you please set off. You are going to force into the reclaimed land that was stolen by the Portuguese 300 years ago. This is a victory. You may have to face a lot of troubles and tribulations. Face them with courage. We are here to help you in your requirements. We will send more manpower and money after you. Go without any hesitancy." Now, it's an interesting question. What makes Malabar a stolen space, a stolen property for the Syrian Christians? Kallidikil, his narrative basically gives some indication of this logic behind such an imagination of laws and redemption. It is stated that Kallidikil says that till 17th century there were Syrians and Syrian churches in the areas of Malabar, and the jurisdiction of Syrian bishops was spread all across the region of Kerala during those days. But after the arrival of Portuguese, he called them Parangigal, somehow the Syrian Christians of North Kerala and South Kerala disappeared. From those localities, the Syrian bishops lost areas of Malabar to their Latin counterparts. So the narratives reflects a kind of ingrained sense of defeat when they lost it, and that turned out to be a moment of triumph with the establishment of the new diocese as the repossession of a kind of a lost property. So the words of caution from Bishop of Pala perhaps conjoins the sense of triumph and the fear of troubles they may face further in Malabar. Now, let me end this story by referring back to a set of narratives Professor Sanal Mohan and his team has collected. The narratives collected recently by Professor Sanal Mohan and his team from Karikotakiri Kattugapara area of Malabar allow us to complicate the Syrian Christian-centric view of Malabar migration. These are memories of migration and migrant life by a group of converted Christians. And these narratives of the Pulaya Christians migrated to Malabar from Travancore tell us their struggle to find a space for themselves in the material domain as well as the Christian world of Malabar. They were subjected to everyday caste discrimination and humiliation in the Syrian migrant majority Karikotakiri parish, within the church as well as outside, right? And these memories are very, very thick, about those descriptions, about the moment of humiliation and loss. Attempts on the part of this new Christians to take active role in the affairs of the church and faith were resisted by the Syrian Christians by all means. And things turned to an extreme violent kind of situation unleashed on these minority Christians with their decision to abstain from the liberation struggle. And it was one Father Joseph Taffarel, the Latin Catholic priest from Kannur, who helped and saved them from this predicament by offering protection and support, and leading to the establishment of the Kottagapara Latin Catholic Church for these Pulaya Christians who were on the run basically at that point in time. Now, many Syrian Christian migrants too basically account for they basically remembers fondly the services provided by the Latin priest to them in the early years as well. Now, let me conclude now. I think I have taken. This story that I have just narrated accentuates the endurance of affect-based imagination in our modern secular material in explicit religious vocabulary and in implicit moral economies. The promise of a progressive and irreversible obliteration of the religious imagination with advancement of the secular modernization is improbable here, as church and secular narratives of Malabar migration provide a forceful theological substratum to entrepreneurship, hard work, and capital accumulation. The failure of the modern and capital to alter non-Western societies along predetermined lines, as Ranajit Guha has argued, may not explain the coeval adoption of the pre-modern by the modern. So a more reasonable idea would be to suggest that the modern capital and entrepreneurship have enabled the subjects to reinvent religious rationalities to serve conflicting ends, to justify economic transformation engendered by modernity in sacred terms at certain times, and to attribute celestial quality to resist the same change certain other times. And this symbiosis of the oppositional process makes the autonomy of the immanent basically impossible, and anachronistic languages and unimaginable alliances possible in our modern. Thank you.